There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room at the end of a long day, and I imagine you in it now. The light is low. The world outside has gone soft at the edges. If you are the kind of person who has always wanted to understand not just what happened in history, but what it actually felt like to live through it, then settle in. I have a story tonight that begins with something almost impossible to picture. The sun did not disappear. It simply stopped giving warmth. For nearly 2 years in the middle of the 6th century, people across 3 continents looked up at a sky that seemed to have gone wrong. And what followed that strange dim light was not one disaster, but a chain of them stretching across roughly 100 years that would come to be remembered, when it was remembered at all, as one of the hardest stretches of time a human being could have been born into. Harvests failed for years in a row. A plague arrived that emptied cities. An empire that believed itself eternal began quietly to come apart. This is the story of how it happened, and how people lived through it anyway. Picture for a moment a farmer somewhere in the hills above a river valley, in what is now northern Italy in the early spring of the year 536. He has done this work his whole life and his father before him, and there is a rhythm to it that he trusts the way he trusts his own hands. He wakes before light to walk the rows where the first shoot should be pushing up through the soil. But this morning and the morning before it and the morning before that, something is missing. The light itself is wrong. The sun rises technically at the hour it should, yet it gives almost no warmth, and the shadows it casts are pale and strange, as though someone has drawn a thin veil across the whole sky. He stands at the edge of his field for a long moment, the cold air biting at his hands, and he does not yet have a word for what he's looking at. He only knows that the ground beneath his boots feels harder than it should, and that whatever is happening above him, it does not feel like something that will pass by a planting season. He was not alone in noticing. Across the Mediterranean, a senator in the city of Ravenna would soon write with real unease that the sun had lost its accustomed light and cast no shadow at noon, that its heat seemed to have been wasted into feebleness. In Constantinople, a historian would describe the sun giving forth its light without brightness, exactly like the moon. In distant China, chronicles from that same year record snow falling in the middle of summer. None of these people knew one another. None of them had any way to compare notes across the width of a continent. And yet they were all describing in their own words the exact same sky. What is strange when you look closely at this period is how much of what actually happened has only been pieced together in the last few decades through methods that would have sounded like magic to the people living through it. Ice cores drilled from glaciers high in the Alps, rings inside ancient trees thinner in some years than others, holding a kind of weather diary going back thousands of years. It took modern scientists comparing frozen air bubbles and tree growth patterns from opposite ends of the earth to confirm what medieval chroniclers had already been telling us all along, in their own frightened, careful words. And once you understand what triggered that strange light in the sky, you start to see how a single event half a world away and barely recorded at the time could reach into the daily life of a farmer in Italy, a monk in Ireland, and a family already living at the edge of survival in the Andes, and change the shape of all their lives at once. Before we go further into how that happened, I want to pause for just a moment. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the kind that is told slowly with real care, for both the facts and the people who live them, it helps enormously if you take a moment to follow along and leave a like as you settle in. It costs nothing, and it lets me know this is the sort of story worth telling more of. And if you feel like it, leave a note in the comments about where you are listening from tonight and what drew you to a story like this one. I read every one and I would love to know. For now, let yourself get comfortable. There is no need to rush anything tonight. What makes this particular stretch of history so difficult to place and so worth understanding is that it never announced itself as a single catastrophe. There was no one morning when everyone woke up and understood that an era of hardship had begun. It arrived instead as a slow accumulation, one bad harvest becoming two, becoming three, a strange cold that would not lift a hunger that spread from household to household, long before anyone had a name for what was causing it. And by the time a name did arrive years later, in the form of a disease that would travel faster and kill more thoroughly than the famine ever had, the world that farmer had known was already changing beneath his feet. The century that followed touched nearly everyone within reach of it. It reached into the palace of an emperor in Constantinople, who believed he was on the verge of restoring the glory of Rome itself. It reached into monasteries in Ireland, where monks kept careful records of failed bread and failing faith. It reached across the ocean to villages on the coast of Peru, where a thriving culture watched its rivers run dry for reasons no one there could have explained. Scholars still debate exactly how connected all of these separate hardships truly were, and how much of the timing was coincidence layered upon coincidence, but the pattern that emerges from the evidence is difficult to ignore. Something happened in the sky in the year 536, and the world spent the better part of a century absorbing the consequences. To understand how deeply this reached into ordinary life, it helps to step back first and see the world as it stood just before the sky changed, because very little of what came next makes sense without it. There was an empire that considered itself the last true inheritor of Rome, ruled by a man convinced he could put the broken pieces of that old world back together. There were kingdoms and peoples scattered across a continent still finding its footing after Rome's collapse in the west. And there was in every one of these places an ordinary rhythm of planting and harvest, of trade and faith and family, that no one imagined could be interrupted all at once from the sky down. That is where this story truly begins, in a world that still believed in the way that all of us tend to believe that tomorrow would look very much like today. The world that stood on the edge of this century of hardship was in its own way still recovering from an older set of wounds. A few generations earlier, the western half of the Roman Empire had come apart, not in a single dramatic collapse, but through a slow unravelling of trade routes, garrisons and governance that left the old provinces to fend for themselves under new rulers. Yet in the east, in the city of Constantinople, something had survived. An empire still stood there, wealthy, walled and deeply convinced of its own permanence, ruled in the year 536 by an emperor named Justinian, a man who had risen from a peasant family in the Balkans to sit on what he considered the last true throne of Rome. Justinian was not a man who accepted the world as he found it. He had already rewritten the empire's entire legal code, compressing centuries of scattered Roman law into a single coherent body of statutes that jurists would still be studying more than 1,000 years later. He had married a former actress named Theodora, a woman of sharp intelligence and considerable political nerve, who had proved to be one of the more capable rulers of her age in her own right. And by the year 536, Justinian had set his sights on something even larger than legal reform. He intended to reclaim the western territories Rome had lost to knit the Mediterranean world back into a single empire under a single throne. His general Belisarius had already retaken North Africa from the Vandals 2 years earlier, in a campaign so swift and so complete that it seemed to confirm every ambition Justinian held. Italy, the ancient heart of Rome itself, was next. It is worth sitting with that ambition for a moment because it tells you something about the mood of the empire just before everything changed. This was not a fragile, fearful society bracing for catastrophe. It was a confident one, flush with the recent victory, governed by a man who genuinely believed he was on the verge of restoring the world to what it once had been. Constantinople itself in these years was one of the great cities of the earth, Home to perhaps 500,000 people, its harbour filled with grain ships from Egypt, its markets carrying silk from far beyond any border its own soldiers had ever crossed. A person walking through its streets in the year 535 would have had very little reason to suspect that anything was about to go wrong, and yet the world beyond the walls of that city was in its own quiet way, already showing signs of strain that had nothing to do with armies or emperors. Population had grown steadily for generations across much of the Mediterranean and Europe, filling the land right up to the edges of what it could reasonably support. Farming had pushed into marginal soil, the kind that produces well in a good year and fails hard in a bad one. Trade networks stretched further than they ever had, which meant that a disruption in one place could ripple outward into places that had never had any direct contact with the original cause. It is a pattern historians recognize across many periods of history. A society reaches a kind of ceiling stable enough to feel permanent, but with very little margin left to absorb a genuine shock. What that farmer in the hills above Ravenna did not know, standing in his cold dim field, was that this margin was about to be tested in a way that no living person in his world had ever experienced. Here is where the story becomes in a strange way a detective story as much as a historical one. For centuries historians simply had the written accounts. Procopius in Constantinople describing a sun that gave light without warmth. Cassiodorus in Ravenna writing to provincial governors about a sky that had lost its colour. Irish monastic chronicles noting a failure of bread that stretched across several consecutive years. These accounts were vivid, and they were consistent with one another across enormous distances, but for a long time no one could say with certainty what had actually caused them. Was this exaggeration the kind of dramatic language people reach for during a hard winter? Was it a single, isolated event or the beginning of something longer? The answer came eventually not from old manuscripts but from ice. High in the Swiss Alps, a glacier had been quietly recording the atmosphere of the ancient world for thousands of years, layer by layer, the way sediment builds on a lake bed. Trapped inside those layers of ice are tiny particles, sulfates, dust traces of volcanic ash laid down year by year and preserved by the cold. In the early 2010s, a team of researchers led by the historian Michael McCormick and the glaciologist Paul Majewski drilled a core from that ice and began reading it the way one might read the rings of an ancient tree, only with far greater precision down to individual seasons. What they found in the layer corresponding to early 536 was a massive spike in volcanic sulfates, evidence of an eruption powerful enough to send fine particles high into the stratosphere, where they could circle the globe and block a measurable portion of the sun's light for months, even years at a time. Where exactly that eruption occurred is a question scholars still debate. Some evidence points toward Iceland, others suggest a source in North America or somewhere closer to the tropics, and the honest answer is that the picture is not yet complete. What is far better established is the effect. Tree rings from Scandinavia to the Alps to the mountains of Asia all show the same signature in the year 536, a season of almost no growth at all. The clearest kind of evidence a tree can leave behind of a summer that simply failed to arrive. Average temperatures across Europe dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees, and in a second eruption just a few years later in 539 or 540, they would drop again even further. For anyone trying to grow food using methods refined over centuries for a climate that no longer existed, this was not an inconvenience. It was a slow-moving catastrophe measured in empty granaries and thinning children. There is a detail from this period that tends to surprise people because it comes from a place few would expect. Far to the north in what is now Scandinavia, archaeologists have found an unusual number of gold hoards dating to precisely this window of time, buried deliberately in the ground and never retrieved. Settlements in parts of Sweden that had been continuously occupied for generations appear to have been abandoned around this same period, their populations declining sharply within a few short years. One interpretation held by a number of researchers studying the region is that these buried treasures represent offerings desperate attempts by frightened communities to appease gods they believed had taken the sun away to restore an order in the world that had visibly undeniably broken. It is impossible to know for certain what was in the minds of the people who buried that gold and never came back for it, but the physical evidence of fear sitting quietly in the ground for 1500 years tells its own kind of story, one that no chronicle from Constantinople or Ravenna ever thought to record. What makes this period so difficult to categorize and in some ways so much more human than a simple list of disasters is how differently it was experienced depending on where a person happened to live. In Constantinople, the shortfall meant rising grain prices and growing unease, but the empire's vast trade networks and stored reserves could absorb a bad season, even a bad few seasons, without fully breaking. In smaller agricultural communities across the countryside in Italy and Gaul, in the British Isles, there was no such buffer. A failed harvest there meant hunger within months, and a second failed harvest on top of it meant something closer to collapse. The same volcanic winter that was for an emperor in his palace a troubling anomaly to be managed was for a farmer in the hills an existential threat with no clear end in sight. And it is worth pausing here on something easy to overlook. None of the people living through this understood it as a single connected event unfolding across the globe. They had no way to know that the same darkened sky troubling a monk in Ireland was in that same season also darkening the skies over villages in Peru and rice paddies in China. Each community experienced its own local hardship, made sense of it through its own local stories and its own local fears, and had no way of grasping the sheer scale of what was actually happening to the world all at once. That is in many ways the quiet tragedy underneath this entire period. A planet-wide catastrophe experienced everywhere as an intensely private one. By the end of that first terrible stretch of cold years, the world had not yet seen the worst of what was coming. The famine had weakened bodies and strained the fragile trust between rulers, and the ruled, but famine alone, however brutal, tends to loosen its grip eventually as soil recovers and skies clear. What no one in Constantinople or Ravenna or the quiet farming valleys of Italy could have anticipated was that the true catastrophe of this century was not the darkened sun at all. It was something else entirely, something already stirring far to the south in the crowded granary towns along the Egyptian coast, waiting for the right conditions to begin its journey north. Word count 1523. There is a peculiar kind of quiet that falls over a place when the harvest fails not once but twice. The first bad year a household can absorb. There are stores set aside favours owed by neighbours, a grim faith that next season will right itself. It is the second failed harvest that changes something in a community, that turns caution into fear, and fear eventually into desperation. And it is that second year arriving in 537 that the written record of this period begins to sound less like weather and more like grief. In Ireland, at the edge of the known world as far as Constantinople was concerned, monks kept careful, almost obsessive records of the years passing around them, noting deaths of kings, movements of armies, and in these years, something far more mundane and far more devastating. A failure of bread, one entry reads, spanning from 536 to 539, 4 consecutive years marked in the annals, not by battle or plague, but by the simple, repeated failure of grain to grow. It is worth sitting with how unusual that is. Most chronicles of this era across most cultures record the dramatic. Kings was omens in the sky. For a monastery to devote repeated attention across 4 separate years to the plain fact that bread had failed tells you something about how deeply that failure had cut into daily life. Hunger, when it stretches on that long, stops being an event and starts becoming the entire shape of a person's world. On the opposite side of the globe, in territory that had no contact whatsoever with Ireland or Constantinople, Chinese chroniclers were recording something almost identical. Summer snow, they wrote, in a season when snow should have been unthinkable. Crops that should have been standing tall in the fields simply did not grow, and in some regions, drought followed the cold in a cruel sequence, first killing what little had managed to sprout, then denying the soil any chance of recovery the following season. Later, Chinese records describe what amounted to years of dust falling like snow, a phrase historians still debate the precise meaning of whether it referred to actual volcanic ash carried on high winds, or simply the driest, most barren fields anyone could remember. Either way, the pattern matches what monks in Ireland and senators in Ravenna were describing at almost exactly the same time thousands of miles away, with no way of knowing the other existed. It's tempting hearing accounts this consistent to imagine the whole world locked in the same singular winter, but the reality on the ground was messier and in its own way more human than that. Famine rarely kills through starvation alone. It kills by opening a door that disease and violence are only too willing to walk through. A body weakened by 2 or 3 years of poor nutrition has little left to fight off illnesses that in a healthier season it might have shrugged off entirely. Historians who study this period point to a rise in what they describe carefully as opportunistic disease. Not the Great Plague that was still a few years away, but smaller, quieter outbreaks, dysentery, respiratory illness. The kind of sickness that spreads easily through a population already too thin and too tired to resist it. These deaths rarely made it into any chronicle by name. They simply accumulate invisibly in the space between the lines of a monk's note about failed bread. There is also the matter of what hunger does to the bonds between people, and this is where the story becomes harder to tell gently, though I will try. When food runs short across an entire region, the strain does not distribute evenly. Those with stored wealth, land, or political connection tend to weather it, while those without slip further and further toward the edge. Rome and Byzantine sources from this exact period describe rising banditry along trade roads, communities turning inward and suspicious of travellers, and in at least a few documented cases, local uprisings against landowners or officials seen as hoarding grain, while others starved. None of this reached the scale of full rebellion, at least not yet, but it reveals something important about how a climate disaster becomes almost inevitably a social one. The sky did not choose who would suffer most. The existing structure of who held power and who did not made that choice instead. Here the story travels somewhere that might genuinely surprise you because the reach of this cold, hungry decade extended far beyond anywhere its victims could have imagined. All the way across an ocean to the western coast of South America, to a civilization called the Moche, who had built one of the most sophisticated societies in the Americas along the river valleys of what is now northern Peru. The Moche had no contact with Rome, no knowledge that an empire even existed on the far side of the world, and yet the archaeological record shows their world unravelling during this exact same window of decades through drought rather than cold. Sediment cores pulled from lake beds in the region show a sharp sustained decline in rainfall beginning in the middle of the 6th century, precisely the years when Europe and Asia were reeling from their own climate catastrophe. Moche irrigation canals, engineering marvels that had sustained agriculture in an otherwise arid landscape for generations, began to fail as the rivers that fed them ran low. Their great ceremonial structures built to honour gods believed to control rain and harvest were, in some cases, deliberately dismantled and rebuilt during this period, which some archaeologists interpret as a sign of religious and political upheaval, communities losing faith in the leaders and rituals that had failed to bring the rain back. Whether the drought that struck Peru shares any actual physical connection to the volcanic winter troubling the Northern Hemisphere is a question scholars still debate, and the honest answer is that the picture is not yet complete. Some researchers argue that large volcanic eruptions can disrupt global weather patterns broadly enough to affect rainfall on the far side of the planet, shifting the very systems that bring monsoon rains to South America. Others urge caution, noting that droughts happen for many reasons and that establishing a direct causal link across such distance requires more evidence than currently exists. What can be said with confidence is only this. In this same narrow window of decades on opposite sides of the Earth, in civilizations that had no knowledge of one another, the climate turned against the people living through it, and both societies were forced to reckon, each in their own language, each through their own gods and stories, with a world that no longer behaved the way it always had. I find something quietly humbling in that. We tend to think of history as a chain of cause and effect that people at the time could see and understand: kings making decisions, armies marching with clear purpose. But the people living through these years, whether in a monastery in Ireland, a rice paddy in China, or a temple complex above a drying river in Peru, had no way of knowing they were part of anything larger than their own immediate suffering. They simply endured what was in front of them, made whatever sense of it their traditions allowed, and did what people facing hardship have always done. They adapted, they prayed, they buried what they could not eat, and they waited for a sign that the world intended to right itself. Back in the heart of the Byzantine world, that sign had not yet come. By the last years of this famine stretch, the strain on Constantinople itself was becoming difficult to ignore, even for an emperor as ambitious and as confident as Justinian. Grain shipments from Egypt, the breadbasket that had fed the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, were arriving thinner and less reliably than before, and the price of bread within the city's own markets had begun to climb in ways that made officials nervous. Justinian's war to reclaim Italy was still grinding forward, expensive and far from finished, and every disruption to the empire's food supply threatened to undercut the resources his campaigns depended on. It was, in the language of the time, a difficult season, a hard stretch that a wealthy and well-organized empire could reasonably expect to survive. What no one in that city could have known as the famine years finally began to loosen their grip, and the fields at last showed the faintest signs of recovery, was that the true test of the empire's endurance had not yet arrived. Somewhere along the crowded, humid coastline of Egypt, in the granary towns that fed half the Mediterranean world, something else had already begun to stir, something that would make the hunger of the past several years feel, in hindsight, almost survivable by comparison. Somewhere in the middle of all that hunger, in the very years when Irish monks were recording failed bread and Chinese farmers were staring at snow that should never have fallen. In summer, the city of Constantinople was doing something that seems on its face almost impossible to reconcile with a famine. It was building the largest and most audacious church the world had ever seen. The story of how that building came to exist begins a few years earlier, in 532, with an event that had nothing to do with weather or grain, and everything to do with the fragile, dangerous business of holding power in a city as vast and as volatile as Constantinople. A riot broke out that year, born from something as ordinary as rival chariot racing factions, and it spun within days into the closest Justinian would ever come to losing his throne entirely. Mobs burned significant portions of the city, including the grand cathedral that had stood as the empire's spiritual heart for generations. Justinian, by some accounts, seriously considered fleeing the capital altogether. It was Theodora, his wife, who is said to have refused to run, telling him, according to the historian Procopius, that the purple of an emperor made a fine burial shroud. Whether those exact words were ever spoken is impossible to know for certain, and scholars still debate how much of Procopius's account of Theodora reflects genuine history, rather than the particular biases of a man who in other writings seemed to despise her. What is not in dispute is that the riot was crushed brutally, with tens of thousands killed in the city's great arena in a single day, and that Justinian emerged from it more determined than ever to rebuild and to rebuild bigger than before. That rebuilding became the church that still stands today, known as Hagia Sophia, and its construction unfolded across exactly the same years as the volcanic winter and the famine that followed it. Justinian assigned two mathematicians, not traditional architects, to design a dome unlike anything attempted before a vast shallow curve of brick and mortar meant to seem to anyone standing beneath it as though it floated without support. Thousands of labourers worked the site for years, hauling marble from quarries as distant as Egypt and Anatolia, gold leaf applied by hand across ceilings so high that workers on scaffolding could barely make out the faces of those below them. The building was completed in 537, which places its finishing touches directly inside the very years when bread was failing across Ireland and crops were dying under an unnaturally dim sun. It is worth letting that sit for a moment. While farmers a few provinces away were burying what little grain they had left and watching their children go hungry, the resources of an empire were being poured quite literally into golden marble rising over the skyline of its capital. This is not, I think, a simple story of cruelty or indifference, though it can look that way from a distance. Empires in crisis have always faced this same brutal arithmetic, the tension between the immediate needs of the many and the symbolic unifying power of a single grand achievement. Justinian seems to have genuinely believed that a magnificent Hagia Sophia was not a distraction from the empire's troubles, but an answer to them, a visible proof that Constantinople remained blessed, prosperous and eternal even as the sky darkened and the harvests failed. When the building was finally finished, Justinian is said to have walked into its vast interior for the first time and declared that he had surpassed Solomon, the biblical king, remembered for building the great temple in Jerusalem. Whether he actually spoke those words or whether later writers simply thought he should have, no one can say with full certainty, but the sentiment behind them was almost certainly real. This was a ruler who saw himself standing at the summit of human achievement even as the ground beneath his empire had already begun quietly to shift. And in a strange way, Justinian's ambitions elsewhere seemed to confirm that belief. Far to the west, his general Belisarius had pushed the campaign to reclaim Italy forward with startling success. Rome itself, the ancient capital that had not answered to an Eastern emperor in generations, fell under Byzantine control. For the first time in decades, an emperor in Constantinople could claim to rule at least nominally over the actual city of Rome along with North Africa, along with a growing stretch of the Italian peninsula. Coins were minted celebrating the reconquest. Court poets composed verses praising Justinian as the restorer of the ancient world. To anyone standing inside the walls of Constantinople in that moment gazing up at the newly finished dome of Hagia Sophia, it must have felt very much as though the difficult years of failed harvests were fading behind them, the price paid perhaps for a restoration that history would remember as glorious. Is it possible, though, to build an empire's confidence on a foundation that has already begun to crack? That is the question worth sitting with here, because the truth visible only now with the benefit of distance is that Justinian's empire in these years was carrying weight it did not fully understand. The wars in Italy, however triumphant they appeared on paper, were extraordinarily expensive, draining treasuries and manpower, even as they expanded the map. The famine years had thinned the population and strained the agricultural base that fed the capital, even if the city's granaries fed by ships from Egypt had so far managed to keep Constantinople itself relatively insulated from the worst of it. And it was that very connection to Egypt, the lifeline of grain, that made Constantinople's survival possible during the famine years that would soon prove to be something else entirely. A pathway unguarded and unimagined for the next catastrophe to travel along There is a detail from this period that historians have only recently begun to appreciate fully, and it concerns the ships themselves. The same vessels that carried wheat from the fertile Nile Delta up to Constantinople's harbour, keeping the capital fed through years, when much of the empire was going hungry, ran on a fixed and predictable seasonal rhythm, arriving in waves timed to the harvest and to the winds. It was an efficient system refined over centuries, and it had made Constantinople one of the best-fed large cities in the ancient world. What no one in the 5th or early 6th century could have anticipated was that this same efficient network, so reliable in carrying grain, could carry something else with equal reliability, something small enough to travel unnoticed in the dark holds of a grain ship hidden among the sacks of wheat that were keeping an empire's capital alive. The evidence for what happened next comes to us today from several directions at once, from the written testimony of people who lived through it, and more recently from something almost unimaginable to anyone in the 6th century, the genetic material still recoverable from the teeth of the dead buried for 1,500 years in mass graves along the routes this catastrophe would travel. What that evidence shows, layered together, is the story of an empire standing at what felt like the very height of its power, celebrating a restored Rome and a dome that seemed to float above the earth, entirely unaware that somewhere along its own busy shipping lanes, something was already moving quietly north. Egypt in the 6th century was the single most important place on earth if you wanted to keep an empire fed. Its fields along the Nile produced grain in such abundance that Constantinople depended on it almost entirely, an arrangement that had held more or less unbroken for centuries. Which is why the small port town of Pelusium, sitting at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta where the river finally gives way to the Sinai Desert, mattered so much more than its size would suggest. Ships loaded there, ships left from there, and in the year 541 something else left from there as well. Something that had nothing to do with wheat and everything to do with what had been living quietly among it. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that the disease did not begin in Egypt at all, but arrived there from somewhere much further away, carried along trade routes that stretched deep into Central Asia. For years, historians debated where exactly the plague originated, and the honest answer is that the evidence remains incomplete even now. Some researchers point toward the mountains near the border of modern Kyrgyzstan and China, where wild rodents called marmots have carried a version of this same disease for thousands of years, largely undisturbed in a kind of natural equilibrium with the creatures that host it. Trade along the Silk routes connecting that region to the Mediterranean had been growing for generations, carrying silk and spices in one direction, and it now seems likely something considerably less welcome in the other. The disease itself is one you may have heard named before, though its 6th century arrival predates the outbreak most people picture when they hear the word plague by nearly 800 years. This was the same family of illness that would later devastate medieval Europe as the Black Death, caused by a bacterium that travels historically inside fleas that live on the bodies of black rats. And this is where the story circles back quietly to everything that came before it, because those rats had spent the previous several years living through the exact same cold, hungry world as everyone else. Some researchers who study the ecology of this period have proposed a connection worth sitting with, that the volcanic winter and the crop failures that followed it may have disrupted rodent populations across Central Asia in ways that pushed them into closer contact with human settlements than usual, searching for food in granaries and grain stores that had never been so heavily guarded and so heavily needed. Whether this ecological pressure directly triggered the outbreak is something scholars still debate, but the timing a catastrophic climate event followed within a few years by the eruption of a devastating plague is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Whatever set it in motion, by the time the disease reached Pelusium, it had found ideal conditions to spread. Grain ships were unknowingly an almost perfect delivery system, dark holds full of exactly the kind of stored food that draws rats sailing on a fixed and predictable schedule to some of the most densely populated cities on Earth. The historian Procopius, who happened to be living in Constantinople at the time, and would go on to leave the most detailed surviving account of what followed, described the disease beginning at Pelusium and then splitting in two directions at once. One branch moving east toward Palestine and Syria, the other moving north and west straight toward the capital. What did it actually look like for the people who first encountered it? The descriptions that survive are careful and specific, the kind of detail that suggests eyewitnesses rather than rumour. A sudden fever arriving without warning, followed within a day or two by hard, painful swellings in the groin beneath the arms or behind the ears. Some who developed these swellings recovered. Many did not, and death could come with startling speed, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms appearing, sometimes stretched out over several agonizing days. Physicians of the time, working from the medical knowledge available to them, tried lancing the swellings, tried herbal remedies, tried every treatment their training offered, and found that almost none of it made any real difference. There was quite simply nothing in the 6th century medical tradition equipped to fight something like this. News of the outbreak reached Constantinople before the disease itself did, carried by the same trade ships and travellers who normally brought word of harvests and prices. And here, the record shows something very human, a period of uncertainty and disbelief before the full weight of what was coming became impossible to ignore. Reports arriving from Egypt and Syria described devastation on a scale that must have sounded, to people living in the wealthiest and best defended city in the Mediterranean world, almost too extreme to be entirely true. Constantinople had weathered famine in recent years. It had weathered riots. It had so far weathered every hardship that had come its way. There was no particular reason for its people to believe this would be any different. That confidence did not last long. The disease reached the capital within months, arriving most likely through the very grain ships the city depended on for survival, the same ships that had carried Egyptian wheat to Constantinople's harbour for generations without incident. It is a detail worth pausing on how completely the empire's greatest strength, its vast and efficient network of trade and supply, became in this moment its greatest vulnerability. The very infrastructure that had kept Constantinople fed and prosperous through years of famine was the infrastructure that now carried catastrophe directly to its door, with no delay and no warning system capable of stopping it. There is one detail from this period that tends to surprise people because it involves the emperor himself. Justinian, the same man who had just finished building the largest church the world had ever seen, and who believed he was restoring the glory of ancient Rome, contracted the disease not long after it reached the city. For a period of days, the fate of the entire empire hung on the survival of a single sick man in a palace bedroom, with no clear line of succession settled, and no guarantee that Theodora, however capable, could hold the throne alone if he died. Justinian recovered one of the fortunate ones, though accounts suggest the illness left him changed quieter, and more withdrawn than the ambitious ruler who had ordered Hagia Sophia built just a few years earlier. What survives in the record suggests that even those closest to absolute power in this world had no immunity to what was coming, no protection that money or status or a magnificent new church could provide. By the final months of 541, the pattern emerging from Pelusium had become unmistakable. This was not a regional outbreak that would burn itself out in the towns of Egypt and Syria. It was moving steadily and without any apparent way to be stopped. Along every trade route the empire had spent centuries building, carried by the very ships, the very roads, the very connections that had made Constantinople one of the greatest cities the world had ever known. The empire that had just celebrated the reconquest of Rome, that had just watched its emperor declare himself the equal of Solomon beneath a dome unlike anything built before it was about to discover that its own success, its own reach, its own magnificent interconnected wealth had built the perfect road for its greatest catastrophe to travel. Procopius had a talent for precision that makes reading him even after 1500 years an unsettling experience. He was not prone to exaggeration in the way many ancient historians were, and when he sat down to describe what happened in Constantinople in the spring of 542, his restraint only makes the account more difficult to read, not less. He wrote of a disease that seemed to select its victims almost at random, sparing some who nursed the dying at close range while claiming others who had taken every precaution. He wrote of swellings that appeared without warning, and a fever that could either break within days or carry a person off within hours. And he wrote with the careful eye of a man determined to record the truth, rather than soften it of a city that within a matter of weeks had run entirely out of places to put its dead. The numbers that survive from this outbreak are difficult to verify with modern certainty, and scholars still debate how literally to take some of the figures ancient writers recorded. Procopius himself claimed that at the peak of the outbreak 10,000 people were dying in Constantinople in a single day, a number so staggering that many historians today treat it as an approximation rather than an exact count, the kind of figure a person reaches for when trying to describe something that felt quite literally beyond counting. What is better supported by independent evidence drawn from burial patterns, tax records, and the physical footprint of mass graves discovered by archaeologists is that somewhere between a third and half of the city's population died within a span of a few short months. In a city that had been home to perhaps 500,000 people only a year earlier, that scale of loss is difficult to hold in the mind for very long without looking away. What makes the account so vivid and so quietly devastating is not the mortality figures themselves, but the practical, almost administrative collapse that followed them. Constantinople, like most great cities of the ancient world, had established customs and dedicated spaces for burying its dead family tombs. Church cemeteries established rites overseen by clergy who knew exactly how a body ought to be treated on its way out of the world. Within weeks, none of that could function anymore. Gravediggers themselves began dying in numbers too large to replace. Families who had lost several members in a single household found there was simply no one left with the strength or the time to carry out proper burial for each one. Justinian, still recovering from his own bout with the disease, is recorded as having ordered a government official named Theodore to take charge of the crisis directly, and what Theodore organized reveals just how far beyond ordinary the situation had become. Bodies were carried across the water to the district of Psyche on the far shore of the city's harbour, where the roofs were stripped from the defensive towers along the fortification walls, and the towers themselves used quite simply as pits into which the dead were lowered in staggering numbers. When even that space-filled ships were loaded with corpses and rowed out into open water, the bodies given to the sea because there was by that point nowhere left on land to receive them. It is worth asking gently what a city sounds like under conditions like these, because the answer is not the chaos you might expect. Procopius describes something closer to a strange exhausted silence settling over Constantinople markets, closing not from panic but from the simple absence of anyone left healthy enough to run them workshops, standing empty ships sitting unloaded in the harbour, because there were too few dock workers remaining to move the cargo. Justinian, in the middle of this collapse, took the unusual step of ordering the state to distribute free bread to whoever remained capable of receiving it, since so many of the ordinary structures of commerce and labour that normally fed the city had simply ceased to function. For a period of weeks, an empire that prided itself on order and law found itself governing something closer to a city holding its breath, waiting to see who among the living would still be standing when the disease finally loosened its grip. The scientific confirmation of exactly what this disease was would not arrive for nearly 15 centuries, and it came appropriately enough from the very dead the outbreak left behind. In the past 2 decades, researchers using techniques that would have sounded like pure fantasy to Procopius have extracted genetic material directly from the teeth of skeletons recovered from mass burial sites connected to this exact period sites in Germany, in France, in the region around the eastern Mediterranean. What that ancient deoxyribonucleic acid revealed published in a series of studies that confirmed what many historians had long suspected was the unmistakable genetic signature of the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism responsible for the outbreak that would later devastate medieval Europe as the Black Death. This was not a mysterious, unidentifiable sickness lost to time. It was the same disease arriving 8 centuries earlier, striking a world with even less capacity to understand or resist it than the one it would return to visit later. There is a detail from this genetic research that tends to surprise people because it complicates a story that might otherwise sound too simple. Analysis of the ancient bacterial samples suggests that this 6th century strain was in certain respects distinct from the later medieval outbreak, evidence of a disease that had evolved and changed across the centuries between the two events. Some researchers argue this 6th century strain may eventually have died out entirely as a widely circulating human pathogen, only for a related but different lineage to re-emerge centuries later as the Black Death, rather than the same continuous outbreak simply lying dormant and waking again. The full relationship between these two catastrophic visitations, separated by roughly 800 years, remains an active area of research, and the evidence, while growing steadily more detailed, is not yet complete enough to settle every question involved. What is beyond dispute is the reach of what happened in 542, because it did not confine itself to Constantinople. Following the same trade routes and shipping lanes that had carried it north from Egypt in the first place, the disease spread outward across the entire Mediterranean world within a remarkably short span of time, reaching Italy, reaching Gaul, reaching as far as the British Isles within a handful of years. Wherever it travelled, it followed a pattern uncomfortably similar to what Constantinople had already endured, arriving suddenly, killing with startling speed, and then, in most places, eventually receding, only to return again in smaller waves across the following decades. Some historians who study this period describe not a single outbreak, but a recurring cycle of plague would continue resurfacing periodically for roughly 200 years afterward, each new wave finding a population that had only partially recovered from the last. For Justinian himself, the human cost was inseparable from a political and military one that would only become clear over the years that followed. His war to reclaim Italy, so triumphant just a few years earlier, now had to be fought by an empire with a fraction of the manpower and treasury it had commanded before the outbreak began. The vision of a fully restored Roman world, the dream that had inspired both the reconquest of Italy and the construction of Hagia Sophia, was still technically alive in the years immediately following the plague. But the resources required to sustain that vision, the soldiers, the tax revenue, the sheer human capacity a great empire depends on to project power across a continent, had been cut away in a matter of months by something no army could fight and no wall could keep out. There is in the account Procopius left behind one detail I find myself returning to more than any other, because it says something true about how people actually endure catastrophe rather than how we imagine they should. He notes that even in the depths of the outbreak, even as the city's normal life had all but stopped, people continued marrying, continued attending to whatever business could still be conducted, continued in whatever small ways remained available to them, trying to live an ordinary life inside an entirely extraordinary catastrophe. It is easy looking back across such distance to see only the scale of the tragedy, the staggering numbers, the towers filled with the dead. It is harder and perhaps more important to remember that every one of those numbers was a person who woke that morning still hoping in some quiet way that today might be the day the sickness finally began to lift. What none of them yet knew was that the empire itself, however it managed to survive this single catastrophic year, would spend the rest of the century living in the long, uneven shadow this outbreak had cast across everything that came after it. And there is a number from this period that historians return to again and again, not because it is dramatic in the way a battle or a plague outbreak is dramatic, but because of how quietly devastating it is once you sit with what it actually means. Rome, at the height of the ancient empire, had been home to somewhere close to 1 million people, the largest city the ancient world had ever produced, its aqueducts feeding public baths, its granaries feeding forums, its streets crowded enough that laws had once been passed simply to manage the traffic of carts moving through them by day. By the middle of the 6th century and the years following the plague, and in the middle of the very war, Justinian had launched to reclaim the city for his restored empire. The population of Rome had fallen to somewhere in the range of a few tens of thousands. Some estimates from this exact period, drawn from the size of the areas still inhabited within the old walls, suggest a number as low as 30,000, perhaps even fewer. A city built to hold 1 million people was within living memory of people still alive at the time, echoing with the footsteps of a population smaller than a single modern neighborhood. The war that produced this collapse is one that rarely gets the attention it deserves, overshadowed in most retellings by the more famous plague that struck in the same general era. And yet the Gothic War, as historians now call it, dragged on for nearly 2 full decades and reshaped Italy more thoroughly than almost any conflict before it. It began with real promise for Justinian's side. His general Belisarius, fresh from his swift conquest of North Africa, landed in Italy in 535 and moved with startling speed, taking Naples, then Rome itself, in a campaign that seemed for a moment to confirm every ambition the emperor held. But the Ostrogothic kingdom that had ruled Italy for 2 generations by that point did not simply disappear, and what followed was not a quick reconquest, but a grinding, exhausting back and forth that would see the city of Rome itself change hands not once, not twice, but several times over the course of the fighting, each transfer of control accompanied by siege, by starvation, by the slow strangling of a city's ability to feed and sustain itself. It's worth pausing on what a siege actually meant for the people living inside a city like Rome in this period, because the word itself can flatten something that was for the people experiencing it agonizingly slow and specific. When the Ostrogothic king Witigis besieged Rome in 537, one of his first acts was to cut the aqueducts that had fed the city's water supply for centuries, channels of stone and concrete that had carried fresh water down from the surrounding hills since the earliest days of the Roman Republic. Some of those aqueducts had survived nearly 600 years of history, outlasting emperors, outlasting the fall of the Western Empire itself, and they were severed in a matter of days by an army determined to starve a city into submission rather than storm its walls. The mills that ground the city's grain, many of them powered by the very aqueduct water now cut off, fell violented as well, and the defenders inside the walls, Belisarius among them, were forced to improvise rigging, floating mills anchored in the Tiber River itself, powered by the current rather than the channeled water the city had relied on for generations. It is a small, almost inventive detail buried inside a much larger tragedy, the kind of resourcefulness people summon when survival demands it, and it worked for a while, keeping just enough flour moving through the city to hold off the worst of the starvation during that particular siege. Not every resident of Rome had the luxury of that kind of ingenuity reaching them in time. Contemporary accounts describe a population reduced during the worst stretches of these repeated sieges to eating whatever could be found, grass pulled from between paving stones. The flesh of animals no one would ordinarily have considered food, and in the most desperate accounts that survive something closer to outright starvation spreading through neighbourhoods that had within living memory been among the most prosperous in the known world. Scholars still debate how literally to take some of the most extreme claims in the ancient sources, since writers of this period sometimes reached for dramatic language to convey suffering rather than precise documentation. But even allowing for exaggeration, the pattern across multiple independent accounts, multiple sieges and multiple years, points towards something undeniably real, a great city being slowly, methodically starved by a war that neither side seemed capable of ending. What makes this stretch of the conflict feel especially heavy is the way it kept repeating. In 546, after years of exhausting warfare had already ground both sides down, the Ostrogothic king Totila, who had emerged as a far more capable commander than his predecessors, captured Rome again, and by some accounts the city he took was so depopulated and so thoroughly stripped of resources that he seriously considered abandoning it entirely, tearing down its walls and leaving it as an unfortified ruin rather than a city worth holding at all. He was talked out of that decision reportedly by Belisarius himself, who is said to have sent a letter arguing that a Rome destroyed would be a wound that all of history would remember Totila for inflicting. Whether that exchange happened exactly as later writers described it, no one can say with certainty, but the fact that abandoning Rome was even seriously considered tells you something about how far the city's fortunes had fallen. This was, after all, the same city Justinian had gone to war specifically to reclaim the symbolic heart of everything his restoration of Rome was meant to represent. And for one brief strange moment in the middle of the 6th century, an enemy king stood inside its walls wondering whether it was even worth the trouble of keeping standing. Rome would change hands again after that, and again after that, each cycle of siege and recapture further thinning a population that had already been devastated by plague and famine in the years leading up to the war. By the time the fighting finally ground to its conclusion in the early 550s, after Justinian sent reinforcements and a new commander who finally managed to defeat Totila's forces for good, Italy itself had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The prosperous, densely settled countryside that had supported Roman civilization for centuries lay largely abandoned, its farms untended, its roads crumbling, its cities. Not just Rome, but many others across the peninsula reduced to a fraction of what they'd been only a generation earlier. Justinian had, in a strict technical sense, won his war. Italy was once again briefly part of a Roman Empire ruled from Constantinople. But the Italy he had won bore almost no resemblance to the wealthy, populous peninsula he had set out to reclaim nearly 20 years earlier, and the empire that had spent so much treasure and so many lives reconquering it would hold on to that victory for barely a few years before a new group, the Lombards, swept down from the north and claimed much of it for themselves. There is a quiet, difficult truth sitting at the centre of this entire episode, one that I think deserves to be said plainly rather than softened. The vision that drove this war, the dream of restoring Rome to its old glory, was not in itself an unreasonable or a foolish one. Justinian genuinely believed he was healing something broken, reuniting a world that had been fractured for generations, and in some narrow sense, for a handful of years he succeeded. But the cost of that success, measured not in territory reclaimed, but in the lives of the ordinary people who happened to live in the cities and countryside where this ambition played out, was almost unimaginably steep. A city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the single greatest urban achievement in human history spent 2 decades being starved, captured, starved again and captured again by 2 armies, each convinced their cause was the righteous one, while the people caught in between simply tried day by day to find enough to eat. It is easy from this distance to speak of the Gothic War as a single event with a beginning and an end, a chapter that can be summarised and then closed. But for the people who actually lived through it, who watched their aqueducts run dry and their markets empty and their neighbours grow thin, there was no way to know in any given year whether the fighting they were enduring represented the middle of their suffering to very nearly its end. What the evidence increasingly suggests, once you step back far enough to see the whole century at once, is that this war in Italy was never really a separate catastrophe from the plague or the famine that came before it. It was instead one more layer in a chain of crises that fed each other, weakening the same populations, straining the same fragile systems of food and governance over and over, until an empire that had believed itself capable of restoring the ancient world found itself instead simply trying to hold together what little of it still remained. Ask any historian working on this period a simple question: how do we actually know any of this happened? And you'll find yourself pulled into one of the more fascinating detective stories in the historical record. Because so little of what we've discussed so far comes from any single reliable source. It comes instead from dozens of fragments scattered across archives, glaciers, tree rings, and most remarkably the bones of the dead themselves, each contributing a small and imperfect piece to a picture that has only become clear in the last 20 years or so. Start with the paperwork, because empires, even collapsing ones, tend to generate paperwork, and Byzantine Egypt left behind an unusually rich supply of it. Preserved by the dry desert climate in a way that would be unimaginable almost anywhere else in the ancient world, thousands of documents written on papyrus have survived from villages along the Nile. Tax registers, property transfers, wills, contracts for labour, the ordinary administrative residue of daily life. Historians studying a collection of these documents from a village called Aphrodito, dating from the years just after the plague reached Egypt, have found something quietly telling. Land that had been carefully divided among many small holders in earlier records appears within a generation consolidated into far fewer hands, worked by far fewer names, taxed at rates that officials seem to be constantly renegotiating downward, as though the government itself understood there simply weren't enough living taxpayers left to meet the old assessments. No single document says the words "plague killed my family," but read together hundreds of them at once, they describe a rural economy that had lost a substantial share of the people who worked it, and had not yet found a way to fill the silence they left behind. Justinian's own government left behind something even more direct in the form of laws. In the years immediately following the outbreak, the emperor issued new legislation addressing what had become apparently an urgent and widespread problem: workers demanding wages far higher than custom allowed, landlords struggling to find anyone willing to farm their fields at any price, and a labour market so disrupted that the old rules governing it no longer seemed to function. One surviving decree complains in language that still carries a trace of genuine exasperation across the centuries that surviving labourers and craftsmen had begun charging double and triple their former rates and orders, those rates capped by law. It is a strange kind of evidence, a law telling you not what happened, but what problem the government was desperately trying to solve, and yet it tells you something the chronicles alone cannot. That the plague's aftermath was not simply a story of grief and burial, but also immediately and practically an economic emergency severe enough to require the personal attention of an emperor still recovering from his own bout with the disease. Then there is the evidence buried far more literally into the ground itself. Beginning in the early 2000s, archaeologists working at sites across northern Europe began uncovering mass graves that did not fit the ordinary pattern of ancient burial pits containing dozens of bodies interred together in a single event, rather than the careful individual burials most cemeteries of this period display. One especially significant site at a place called Aschheim in Bavaria yielded skeletal remains that researchers eventually tested for genetic traces of ancient disease, and in 2005 a team confirmed what many had suspected, but no one had yet proven with certainty the unmistakable genetic fingerprint of the same plague bacterium described in Procopius's account of Constantinople present in bodies buried hundreds of miles from the Byzantine capital, evidence that the outbreak had reached far deeper into the heart of Europe than the surviving written sources had ever described in detail. Similar discoveries followed at other sites in England, in France, in the region. Historians now broadly call the western reach of this pandemic, each new burial ground adding another data point to a map that written history alone could never have drawn. A cemetery in Cambridgeshire in eastern England revealed burial patterns from precisely this period that shifted noticeably. More bodies interred in shorter windows of time than the surrounding decades of ordinary mortality would explain. A kind of demographic scar visible only once archaeologists learned to look for it. What survives in the written record from Britain during these exact years is thin and fragmented. A handful of chronicle entries, brief and uncertain. It is the ground itself and the bones resting inside it that have done the most to confirm just how far this catastrophe travelled beyond the well-documented streets of Constantinople. Is it strange to think that people living 1500 years ago left behind without any intention of doing so exactly the kind of evidence that would one day let strangers understand their suffering in such precise detail? I find something quietly moving in that thought. None of these people, the farmers in Bavaria, the villagers along the Nile, the officials drafting wage caps in a Constantinople still recovering from mass death, ever imagined they were creating a historical record for anyone. They were simply trying to survive, to keep some kind of order functioning in a broken world, to bury their dead with whatever dignity circumstances still allowed. And yet, taken together, their ordinary efforts to endure have given historians something far richer than any single chronicler, however careful, could ever have provided alone. The evidence from glaciers and tree rings that shape the earlier chapters of this story works in much the same way. Small ordinary traces left behind by natural processes that had no interest in recording history, and yet did so anyway with startling precision. Scholars still debate certain details within this reconstruction, the exact origin point of the initial volcanic eruption, the precise mechanism connecting climate disruption to the outbreak of plague, the full relationship between the 6th century strain of the disease and the one that would return 8 centuries later. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and reputable historians disagree sometimes sharply about how tightly these separate catastrophes ought to be woven into a single connected narrative, rather than treated as a series of terrible coincidences that happen to fall within the same rough span of decades. That disagreement, far from being a weakness in the story, is in many ways its most honest feature. Real history rarely resolves into a single tidy explanation, and the scholars who study this period most closely are usually the first to say so. What all of this evidence agrees on across every method and every discipline that has been brought to bear on it is scale. Whatever the precise causal chain connecting a volcanic eruption to a famine to a pandemic to a 2-decade war in Italy, the sheer breadth of the evidence, written and buried, chemical and genetic, confirms that something extraordinary happened across this tough span of 100 years. Something that left its mark not just in the memories of the people who endured it, but in the physical record of the earth itself. And once you begin looking at that evidence closely, once you start comparing what the ice cores say against what the mass graves confirm against what the tax records quietly reveal, a further question begins to surface, one that takes us somewhere this story has not yet gone. Not everyone who lived through this century experienced it or explained it to themselves in the same way at all. Not every historian agrees on how catastrophic this century actually was, and that disagreement deserves to be taken seriously rather than smoothed over, because it comes from careful people working with the same evidence, and arriving in some cases at strikingly different conclusions. In the years following the ice core discoveries and the genetic confirmation of the plague bacterium, a kind of consensus formed quickly in popular retellings that this was without real competition, the single worst stretch of decades in recorded human history. More recently, a handful of scholars have pushed back on parts of that framing, and their objections are worth understanding because they sharpen rather than diminish the story. The historian Lee Mordecai, working at Hebrew University, has spent considerable time examining exactly how contemporary writers described the plague as it was actually happening, rather than relying on the handful of most dramatic passages that tend to get quoted most often. What he found reading widely across the surviving sources, rather than focusing narrowly on Procopius, is that many contemporary texts describe the disease in language that is serious but not uniquely apocalyptic, closer in tone to how writers of that era describe other bad epidemics they had witnessed in their own lifetimes. Mordecai has argued that later retellings, including some modern popular accounts, may have inflated the scale of the outbreak beyond what the original sources actually support, and that Procopius's most vivid, most frequently cited passages, the 10,000 deaths in a single day, the towers filled to their roofs with corpses, may reflect the particular literary style of a writer working within a long tradition of plague narratives stretching back to ancient Athens rather than a precise eyewitness tally. This is not, it's worth saying clearly, an argument that nothing significant happened. Mordecai and other scholars in this camp still accept that a major and genuinely deadly outbreak occurred, that Constantinople and other cities suffered real substantial mortality, and that the disease spread widely across the Mediterranean world over the following decades. What they question is specifically the older higher estimates, some of which proposed that the plague killed a quarter or more of the entire population of the eastern Mediterranean, a figure that would place it among the deadliest events in human history by proportion. The evidence remains incomplete on this exact point, and honest historians on both sides of the debate acknowledge as much. Tax records from Egypt, the kind explored in the last chapter of this story, suggest real demographic disruption, but disruption that some researchers read as moderate and regionally uneven, rather than uniformly catastrophic across the entire empire. Why does this disagreement matter beyond the narrow question of an exact death toll from 1500 years ago? It matters because it reveals something honest about how history actually gets written, which is rarely through a single voice speaking with total authority, but through an ongoing conversation between people examining the same fragments of evidence and weighing them differently. Michael McCormick, whose Ice Core research anchored much of what we've already covered in this story, has responded to these revisionist arguments by pointing back to the physical evidence, the tree rings, the ice layers, the mass graves confirmed through genetic testing, arguing that whatever uncertainty exists around Procopius's specific numbers, the independent scientific record still points toward a genuinely severe, genuinely widespread catastrophe. The debate as it stands today is less about whether something terrible happened, and more about precisely how terrible, and how evenly that terribleness was distributed across a very large and very diverse empire. There is another layer to this story that tends to receive far less attention than Constantinople's suffering, and it comes from the Sasanian Persian Empire, the great rival power that sat just beyond Byzantium's eastern frontier. Persian sources describing this same period are considerably sparser than their Byzantine counterparts, but what survives suggests the plague reached deep into Persian territory as well, striking cities along the same trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world to Central Asia. Some later Arabic and Persian histories written centuries afterward, but drawing on older traditions describe outbreaks striking the Persian capital and surrounding regions during roughly this same window of years, disrupting a kingdom that had been locked in intermittent warfare with Byzantium for generations. What survives in the record suggests that this was never simply a Byzantine catastrophe or even simply a Mediterranean one, but something that reached across a political and religious divide that otherwise defined nearly everything about how these two great empires related to one another. The plague, in other words, did not particularly care which side of the frontier a person happened to live on. The way people explained this catastrophe to themselves in the moment also varied considerably depending on where they stood and what they already believed about how the world worked. Christian writers in Constantinople, including Procopius himself in certain passages, wrestled openly with the theological problem the plague posed a benevolent God allowing suffering on a scale that seemed to defy any simple explanation of divine justice or punishment. Some clergy of the period preached that the outbreak represented judgment for the empire's sins, while others, including apparently Procopius, expressed something closer to genuine philosophical bewilderment, describing the disease as arbitrary, in a way that resisted any tidy moral explanation at all. In the Persian world, Zoroastrian tradition offered its own framework for understanding mass death, one rooted in an ongoing cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness, a lens entirely different from the Christian one, but reaching in its own way toward the same fundamental human need to find some meaning inside senseless loss. Jewish communities scattered throughout the Mediterranean world left behind their own traces of this period as well, thinner in the historical record than either the Christian or Persian material, but present nonetheless in fragments of correspondence and later rabbinic commentary that reference hardship and loss during roughly this era. It is a reminder worth sitting with that the empires and their official chroniclers, however detailed, never told the whole story of who lived through this century, and that entire communities experienced these same catastrophic years through their own separate traditions, their own separate losses largely invisible to the historians who would spend the next 1,500 years relying primarily on the accounts that happened to survive. What emerges when you hold all of these competing accounts side by side rather than collapsing them into a single simple narrative is something more honest and I think more genuinely moving than the tidier version of this story might have offered. This was not one catastrophe experienced identically by everyone unlucky enough to be alive during it. It was dozens of catastrophes layered and overlapping, interpreted through dozens of different traditions, striking with different severity in different places, remembered afterward in wildly uneven detail depending on which empire, which religion, and which language happened to leave behind the most durable written record. The century we have been tracing through ice cores and tax registers and mass graves was in the end made up entirely of individual people trying to make sense of a world that seemed to be collapsing around them, each reaching for whatever framework their own culture had given them to explain why. And once the worst of the dying had passed, once the plague's first devastating wave finally receded, and the survivors in every one of these communities, Christian, Persian, Jewish, and beyond, began the long, uneven work of rebuilding, an entirely new set of questions began to take shape. Not questions of cause any longer, but questions of consequence. What does a world look like politically and economically once it has lost so much of the population that used to hold it together? A labour shortage sounds on its face like a fairly dry economic term, the kind of thing that belongs in a modern policy briefing rather than a story about a civilization brought to its knees. And yet it may be the single most consequential force shaping the decades that followed, the plague reaching into places far removed from Constantinople's harbour, reshaping how power, land and daily survival worked across an entire continent for generations afterward. Consider what happens to a society when a substantial share of its working population simply disappears within the span of a single terrible year. Fields still need planting, buildings still need repair, goods still need to be moved from port to market. But suddenly there are far fewer hands available to do any of it, and the people who survived, who found themselves in possession of skills that had become suddenly sharply scarce, discovered they now held a kind of leverage their parents and grandparents had never known. This is precisely the disruption Justinian's wage-capping laws mentioned earlier were struggling to contain common labour